Labas vakaras. Leiskite pradėti bendrą Atviros Lietuvos fondo ir Šiaurės ministrų tarybos biuro renginį, kuris yra integrali viešų paskaitų ir debatų ciklo permąstant Europą dalimi. Šiandien jūsų laukia susitikimas ir pokalbis su antropologijos profesorium iš Oslo universiteto, Thomas Hyllandu Eriksenu. Good evening, professor. Ir kaip vienas iš renginių ciklo permąstant Europą organizatorių, aš ir kaip Atviros Lietuvos fondo atstovas norėčiau padėkoti Šiaurės ministrų tarybos biurui Lietuvoje už bendradarbiavimą ir itin svarbią pagalbą, organizuojant profesoriaus Thomas Hyllandu Eriksenu kelionę į Lietuvą. Taip pat didžiulis ačiū Lietuvos nacionalinės Mažvydo bibliotekos darbuotojams už tai, kad leido savo puikioje erdvėje surengti mūsų diskusiją. Keletas svarbių pastabų dėl renginio eigos. Kaip jūs žinot, diskusija bus dvikalbė. Jūsų paslaugoms sinchroninis vertimas. Vertimas lietuvių kalba, iš anglų į lietuvių kalbą yra kanale 2. Translation into English language is available on channel 1. O dabar tik keletą žodžių apie profesorių. Kaip aš jau minėjau, Thomas Hyllandu Eriksenu dirba Oslo universitete. Pagrindinės profesoriaus tyrimo temos yra identitetas, nacionalizmas, kosmopolitizmas, globalizacija, migracija, žmogaus teisės. Profesorius parašė 4 knygas apie modernybės pasaulį ir žmogaus vietą šiam pasauly. Ir mus ypatingai domina, žinoma, jo paskutinis projektas vykdytas 2012-2017 metais. Jis vadinasi Perkaitimas, 3 globalizacijos krizės. Aš manau, kad profesorius apie tai pats pakalbės daug daugiau. Labai svarbu yra tai, kad profesorius yra žinomas kaip viešasis intelektualas, kuris dėmesingai seka ir Skandinavijos regiono gyvenimo aktualijas ir tai, kas vyksta Europoje ir pasaulyje, ir aktyviai komentuoja tai savo tekstuose. Aš puikiai suprantu, kad jūs visi laukiat, kada perleisiu žodį profesoriui, todėl tik tai paskutinės porą pastabų dėl mūsų renginio eigos. Profesorius pristatys savo tyrimus 10-15 minučių ir po to prasidės diskusija, į kurią siūlau jums įsitraukti nuo pirmų minučių, nes mes tikrai nenorim paversti šito renginio 2 akademikų pasikalbėjimų. Aš manau, kad tai yra pokalbis, kuriame galim diskutuoti ir dalintis savo mintimis visi. Now, I think it is good time to start our discussion. Professor, the floor is yours. Let's say a few words about your project related with overheated world.
Yes, I can take this. Yes, well, thanks very much, and thanks very much for your kind invitation. It's wonderful to be back in Lithuania and to be back in Vilnius, which I visited several times. But it's been a while since I was in Vilnius last. Actually, I was in Kaunas not so long ago, talking to anthropologists there. So it's lovely to be back, and so I'm very grateful also for the opportunity given to me by the Open Lithuanian Foundation to talk about some of the urgent issues that are facing the world today. So a little bit about the kind of things that I think we're going to discuss more later on, and which relate to some of the things that I have been doing with colleagues and with other people. I'm a social anthropologist, but you know, unlike many social anthropologists, my passion is about understanding modernity and the contemporary world. So my fieldwork has always been about the frictions and the tensions and the challenges and the rewards of complexity, of living in complex societies which change sometimes very fast. But do they change very fast? You know, only the other day I had a conversation with a colleague who does research on food habits in Norway. If you only read the Oslo newspapers, and you only talk with other middle-class people from Oslo, you may get the impression that nowadays people only eat crossover food from Thailand and sushi, and they do a bit of Mexican and so on and so forth. Whereas if you go only a little bit out of the city, maybe just an hour or two, as he did when he did his PhD fieldwork, you discover that there's a lot of continuity and there's a lot of knowledge transmission between the generations about how to cook traditional meatballs with a brown sauce and boiled potatoes and stewed cabbage, traditional dishes. In other words, different parts of a culture, different parts of a society do not change at the same speed. And different activities do not change at the same speed either. Some things can change really fast, such as the adoption of new information technologies, which has been one of my interests for many years. Whereas, and the growth of China, as a leading actor in the world economy, has happened at an enormous speed. And I could even add the number of Lithuanians who come to Norway to work. I've been doing immigration. It's been one of the fields that I've been working on. So I thought I sort of had a fairly good overview of who was in Norway and why they were there and how many there were of each group. And it was almost as if I just went out for a cup of coffee. And when I came back, the Lithuanians were the second largest group of foreign workers in the country after the Poles. So they'd surpassed Swedish people. So some things change really quickly. Whereas other things don't. And I think in this tension between different temporalities, different rhythms, we find some of the sources of the conflicts and tensions and frictions that we see in our societies today. The overheating project that I've been directing for 5 years, and it's officially finished. But you know what it's like with academics. We're a bit slow. So after the project is finished, there's no more money. People will have to find other things to do. The postdocs will have to apply for jobs. One of our PhD students was lucky and got a job in Germany. So we're all fragmented and scattered. And I had to go back and, and do other things. But still, publications continue to come out. So we have 2 or 3 or 4 books in the pipeline. And I just had a book out myself last month on an Australian community. The book is called Boomtown. It's about a society which changes at an enormous speed. It's a society marinated, you might say, in coal and gas. And maybe I'll make some comments about that fascinating town later on. But the project as such was officially finished 5 years ago. And when we spoke about overheating, at first people thought that, this is just another project about climate change. Sorry, yeah, I'm trying to slow down, and my life has slowed down because I got seriously ill 2 years ago, but my mind and my speech hasn't slowed down as much as they should. So I'll try to speak a bit more slowly. So when we talked about overheating at the beginning, and still people think that this is just another project on climate change. And that is part of the story, because climate change is already affecting communities around the world. They notice the effects of climate change in the Philippines, in Bangladesh, in Peru, where suddenly there's no more water in the highlands, and so on. And in places where people don't experience climate change directly. They may talk about it, they may worry about it, they may wonder, what can I do? If I take my bike to work instead of my car, will that help save the glaciers of Greenland? Probably not. So I might as well take the car. So that's part of the story. But overheating is about a much more general set of interrelated processes. It's a lens through which, I would argue, we can understand and study the contemporary globalized world, which is a lens that focuses on accelerated change. Change has been with us forever. Societies have always changed. The Roman Empire came and went, as did the Lithuanian, the great state of Lithuania. It came and went. Inventions have changed the lives of human beings, etc. There have been famines and natural disasters and migrations as long as we've been on this planet. But there is something about modernity. Change started to happen much more quickly from the beginning of the 19th century in much of the world, with the coming of the steam engine, with the marriage of the steam engine and the fossil fuels, which was a blessing for humanity, of course, for a long time. And after the Second World War, change started to accelerate again. And I would say, to cut a long story short, that change started to accelerate again around the early 1990s. As you know better than most in this part of the world, it marked the end of the Cold War and the global hegemony of capitalism and the coming of what is sometimes spoken dismissively of as neoliberalism. So that was one of the things that happened in the early 1990s. Early 1990s also marked the beginning of the, you might say, the popularized computer era, where you and I could go into the shop and get an internet subscription. Most people didn't do that in 1991, but by the end of the century, most people in Europe had a relationship with the internet and with mobile phones, which has changed our lives in ways that we are still struggling to understand. So this happened in the early 1990s, but we also saw other tendencies in the early 1990s. The end of apartheid in South Africa happened around the same time as the end of the Soviet Union, the opening up of South African society to democracy, the deregulation of the Indian economy, I mean, the second most populous country in the world. Suddenly, this economy, which had been quite protected by the state and which had developed in a very sort of sluggish and planned and socialist way, was opened up to the global market forces in the early 1990s. And this was also around the same time that China started seriously to become an actor on the world economic stage. So lots of things were put into place in the early 1990s that we are now seeing the effects of. But we also saw other things happening in the early 1990s, such as the dissolution of Yugoslavia, which was far more violent and brutal and horrible than anybody had expected. The genocide in Rwanda, you know, where several 100,000 people were murdered because of their ethnic identity. So this served as a reminder that this brave new world of the computer, of global capitalism, of the internet, and so on, did not mark the end of old conflicts. In fact, some old conflicts were strengthened and became intensified as a result. So this marks the beginning of this overheated world that I'm looking at, which is too full, too crowded. There's too much activity. There's too much going on at the same time. And nobody really has a hand on the wheel in order to regulate, you know, in order to say that it's enough now, we can stop. Let me give you a metaphor, just to illustrate what I mean by overheating. It's a kind of world in which we now live, and I'm saying that it's not the only lens, but to me it's been a very useful lens through which to view the world as it is today, and to understand phenomena ranging from responses to climate change to responses to mining operations and the rise of right-wing populism and identity politics, which is a global and not just a European phenomenon, by the way. So let me just give you a metaphor. If you rub your hands together really quickly, like I'm doing now, okay? Like this, okay? That season is beginning in Northern Europe. They warm up, right? I mean, you've left home and you've forgotten to bring your gloves, so you rub your hands together and they warm up. And if you could do it really, really fast, your hands would eventually burn up, right? Technically, they would turn into carbon. But you can't do that because your body tells you. Your body has an inbuilt thermostat, which tells you that it's enough now. You're warm, stop. The overheated world, in some ways, resembles this situation, but with one difference, namely that there is no thermostat. There is no instance that says that it's enough now. There are enough tourists in Barcelona. Let's stop the growth of tourism in Barcelona or in Venice. Or which can say that there is enough plastic in the ocean. Because if we continue like this, by the year 2050, there's going to be more plastic than fish in the ocean. So let's stop and let's reduce the amount of plastic. And you see what I mean. There's no instance that can say it's enough. And this is where you get a situation that I call overheating, where things are simply happening too fast for people to be able to follow. And this creates its own problems, which are quite serious. And we're going to talk more about those later, so I'm not going into them now, but one of the main problems that we see as a result of global overheating is the widespread feeling across the world among people that they no longer have a strong influence on their own lives and on their own destinies, because it seems as if decisions are taken elsewhere and people are feeling overrun by accelerated change. Fast changes that nobody asked for and which may have bad consequences for me. Sometimes fast change can have good consequences, and we have examples of this from our research. I mean, keep that in mind. It's not as if all fast change is bad. Some fast change can be really good. It can make life better. So, yeah, I mean, let me give you, if it's okay, yeah, just a short example of accelerated change which is perceived as being positive. I mean, all right, it may be a stupid example, but mobile telephones, the way mobile telephones have evolved, I think lots of people enjoy it. It has side effects, and in fact, that's what I'm writing about right now. I'm trying to write a book about the last 15 years of the communication revolution. And the mobile phone is the key object, the smartphone. But I think millions of people were quite happy to be able to listen to music, to read their email, to even watch a film on the bus or wherever. But a more basic example of fast change, which was perceived as positive, was from one of our researchers' work in West Africa, in Sierra Leone, small West African country, where nothing much happened. Life was very slow. There was always dust. When you bought a loaf of bread along the road, it was covered in dust because people sold bread at the roadside, okay? And all the roads were dirt roads. There was no tarmac on the roads. And now, after 10 years of Chinese and other foreign investments, there's tarmac on the road. So people can you can ride your motorbike without it being stuck in holes and in mud or in, dusty, various, places where there really isn't the road. You can ride your motorbike and you can buy a loaf of bread without dust on it. And people are rather happy about foreign investments bringing jobs. So if fast change happens in this community, for example, on the other side of the little river, there's always been jungle. Suddenly the jungle is gone. And there are some people sort of behind the fence who are growing some stuff. All the trees are gone, but they're growing some stuff. There are some green things that are sort of popping up. And then the anthropologist comes over and says, "So, what's going on here?" And he says, "Well, it's strange, but, this didn't used to be there 2 weeks ago, and maybe I can get a job there too. And I think they're growing biofuel, because it's meant to be ecologically sustainable. But who are the people? Well, I mean, they're not Africans, you can tell by looking at them. But they don't look European either. And then it turns out that they're Chinese, right? Behind the fence. And then the anthropologist finally asked the guy, "So, how do you understand this? Why is this happening here now?" Sensible, reasonable question. And the guy answers that, "Well, man, it's the global. It's the global." And that's one of the things that we're trying to find out, and we've been trying to find out in our project. What do people mean when they say it's the global? And how does the global relate to the local? And can you be both at the same time? Right? And can we control and harness this accelerated change and make it work for the benefit of humanity and not the other way around? So these are some of the questions that we've been asking. I wrote a book that was published a couple of years ago called Overheating, an Anthropology of Accelerated Change, where I look at anything from energy, the growth of energy consumption, to the production of waste, rubbish to tourism and migration and a few other aspects of overheating. And as I said, my recent book, which is empirical, it's a case study from a particular place, builds on that theory and applies it to an empirical case in Eastern Australia. And the book is called Boomtown, Runaway Globalization on the Queensland Coast. So we're still working at it, and there's a lot more work to be done, and I think we need some intellectual tools in order to make sense of what's happening in the world today. Whether we are looking at climate change, tourism, waste, migration, or the rise of right-wing populism, and the way in which the concept of fake news, okay, has spread worldwide. And it was, in fact, the new word of the year in the Oxford English Dictionary of 2016. In 2013, the new word of the year, do you know what it was now? I only happen to know because some people in Australia told me when I was doing fieldwork. It was selfie. The word selfie, that was the new word of the year in 2013. So selfie and fake news, I think those, we can work with those terms and make sense of some of the things that are going on in an overheated world characterized by accelerated change in some areas and deceleration in some other areas. As I said, I mean, in some parts of the world, the problem is not too much speed, but that there isn't enough speed. Nothing's going on. You just sit around and wait for something to happen. This was my experience when I was a teenager back in Norway, by the way. And suddenly the world changed and things started to happen really quickly and perhaps a bit too quickly. So on that note, I give the floor to you. Should we switch between these microphones?
I'll try. Okay, it's working. Thank you very much for really inspiring ideas. Right now I'll switch in Lithuanian language. Profesoriau, aš nepaminėjau vienos knygos, kurią kai kurie atėję šiandien į renginį žmonės atsinešė ir net paprašė jūsų pasirašyti, kuomet mes ją vartėme gerdami kavą prieš renginį. Jūs sakėt, kad 2001-2002 metais, rašydamas šią knygą, tik tai pradėjote apčiuopti simptomus pasaulio, kurie dabar yra sukūrę perkaitusios realybės reiškinį. Jūs kalbat apie 1991 metus kaip lūžio tašką. 90-ieji ir 91-ieji metai mums Lietuvoje yra labai svarbus metai, turint omeny, kad tuo metu mes atkūrėm nepriklausomybę ir kažkuria prasme vos tik tai praardėme tą geležinę uždangą, atsidūrėme pasaulio greitkelyje. Taigi, pirmas mano klausimas tikriausiai yra labai simptomiškas, susitikus jūs, kaip antropologą iš Oslo universiteto Vilniuje, nes aš jaučiuosi besas mažos tautos atstovų globaliame pasaulyje. Ir aš klausiu kai kurių dalykų, taip pat jūsų, žinodamas, kad jūs tyrinėdamas globalų pasaulį kartu buvot labai dėmesingas mažoms tautoms, mažoms grupėms, mažoms bendruomenėms. Ką atskleidė jūsų tyrimo rezultatai? Kokia jūsų nuomonė yra geriausia strategija iš tiesų mažoms visuomenėms, grupėms, bendruomenėms, bandant prisitaikyti prie vis spartesnės pasaulio kaitos ir bandant išgyventi toj perkaitusioj realybėj? Kokios yra gerosios patirtis, kurias jūs pamatėt savo tyrime?
Thank you. It's a great question. But before I answer, I mean, I hope we can return to some of the topics from the tyranny of the moment later on, because it's also a book about acceleration. And I think that in order to understand the political, the ideological situation around the world today, I mean, we need to look at developments in information and communication technology in the last, say, 20 years. I mean, since I wrote that book, when that wasn't as big a problem as it is now, or an issue. Who can we trust? What kind of information can you trust? And how can you learn anything at all from the news when things are sort of moving by at a frightful speed? But to your question, how can small countries, small nations, as it were, survive and retain their sense of being and autonomy and independence and self-determination in this globalizing world? There's no easy way out. I mean, I live in a country which has about 5 million, 5.5, I think now. Population growth in Norway is largely due to immigration. It's not because Norwegians are having more children than before. And you have a country of about 3 million. I've been working recently in a much, much smaller country. So let me just take a short detour there. Much, much smaller, okay? Namely the Seychelles, which is an archipelago in the Indian Ocean. The Seychelles are not the Maldives. People get them mixed up. So the Seychelles are not going to disappear because of the rising seas. I mean, the volcanic islands, granite islands, sorry. Granite, they're made of rock, so they have mountains. But the Seychelles only have 90,000 inhabitants. How can a society with 90,000 people survive as a fully assorted community, a language community, you know, with newspapers, with radio and TV broadcasts in their own language, with a sense of identity that we are Seychellois and we have our own particular culture, our own myths and stories and songs and food and handicrafts, which are unique to us in a world where increasingly even people in Seychelles, I mean, they watch Netflix, they have smartphones, they go on shopping trips to Mauritius, which is another small country, but to Seychelles it's huge, you know, because Mauritius has 1 million people, or even to Cape Town. So how can they survive? What we see increasingly in Seychelles is that young people, I mean, it's a fairly well-off place. They're not poor like in mainland Africa. There's no starvation. I mean, there are people who don't have enough to do, but there are also people who are overworked and stressed. And they even have traffic jams. I mean, they have one sort of street, okay, with traffic jams in the morning and afternoon. And what we see among young people is that they no longer want to be Seychellois. I mean, they want to be American. They want to be African Americans because it's so much cooler to be an African American and you're part of the world. I mean, I'm exaggerating a bit, but this is a concern. It's a tendency. And the people are picking up English at an enormous rate, and they're mixing English words into the Creole, which is their own vernacular language. So there are lots of worries here that the Seychellois identity is being watered down, it's being diluted, and it's being threatened by the onslaught of especially American, but also some French popular culture. And at the level of the economy, what can you do as a small country when you have a deregulated global economy where transportation costs have gone down enormously? You know, I mean, in the past, before the modern container ship, just a little over a generation ago, before the modern container ship, transporting goods was so expensive, and you didn't have dedicated railway lines, you know, which went all the way down to the port. You had armies of heavily unionized, sometimes drunk, you know, sometimes day workers who worked on the port and who were lugging these crates on and off ships. There was breakage, it was expensive, it took a lot of time. Now all of this has been become incredibly more efficient, which means that if you have a factory, even in the interior of China, you can move goods all around the world at a very cheap price and be competitive even in Indiana, United States, in the Midwest, or in Northern Europe. One thing that I noticed in the early 2000s back home was that all of a sudden, certain shops became about 10 times as big as they used to be. The shops where they sold electronics and sports equipment. And the stuff they had inside was really cheap. I mean, it was affordable, you know. A TV set, which used to be quite expensive, was suddenly quite cheap. And everything was made in China. So you have this at the level of the economy. What can a country like the Seychelles, what can a small country produce? And how can you be competitive when we're talking about the global economy of scale, where bigger is always better? right? The short answer is, in order for your culture to survive, your language to survive, you probably need public support. It's not going to happen through the market forces. For translations, for example, of books, translations of literature, for theater, for music, you need public support. Otherwise, all you're going to get is, and it's not necessarily bad, okay, but it's just the same everywhere. It reduces diversity. But what you're going to get is a kind of transnational popular culture. So you need public support for in cultural life. Regarding the economy, I would say, but I'm sure there are divided views on this, but it's important to find niches that you can occupy, which are unique, which are not already taken by others. You can sell stuff which is unscalable. I mean, what they try to sell in the Seychelles, apart from offshore banking, which is, not something I'd recommend others to do, but they try to sell experiences. Come to Seychelles and have the experience of your life, that sort of thing, which you can't get the same experience in China. You can't get it in the United States. So something which is unique, which is only here, and find those niches and exploit them. I mean, that would be one way of going about. But the third answer is make friends with others and align yourself with others and create alliances and create collaborative projects. That's what we're trying to do in research, and that's what we also in Europe, to some extent at least, trying to do in the economy, to work together rather than competing. Because if you're small, it's important for you to make friends, to have collaborators. Right? In the United States, more than half of the population have never been outside of the country. They don't know foreign languages. They're very bad at learning foreign languages, and the majority don't even have a passport because they're big. So there are advantages of being small, right? Because you're open to the world in a way that you wouldn't have been had you been the world, the master of the universe.
Kitas mano klausimas yra susijęs su jausenomis, kurias visi mes patiriam. Ir šiuo atveju tikriausiai visai nesvarbu. Norvegai, lietuviai, ar prancūzai, ar britai esam tam tikros jausenos, negatyvios jausenos, atrodo, kad yra būdingos visiems mums, gyvenantiems 21 amžiaus Europoje. Apie tai jūs taip pat rašot savo tyrimuose, kalbėdamas apie fundamentalias modernaus globalizuoto pasaulio prieštaras. Tos prieštaros parodo, kad globalinė sistema yra, kaip jūs pats sakot, nestabili ir prieštaringa. Kad globalinė sistema yra sunkiai prognozuojama. Kad globalinė sistema gali būti ne tik tai gerbūvio kūrėja, bet ir pavojinga. Atrodo, kad šiuolaikiniame pasaulyje baimė ir netikrumas netgi ima lemti daugelio europiečių visuomeninį ir politinį gyvenimą. Labai dažnai šiandien europiečiai balsuoja prieš kažką, ne už kažką. Prieš, nes jie bijo. Beveik prieš mėnesį kitame Atviros Lietuvos fondo renginyje viešėjęs profesorius Klaus Segbers savo paskaitą užbaigė tokiais žodžiais. Šiandien europiečiai privalo išmokti gyventi su netikrumu širdyje. Tai yra mūsų gyvenimo kasdienybė. Kaip jūs kaip antropologas galėtumėt pakomentuoti tą politikos mokslų profesoriaus teiginį? Kaip jums atrodo, kaip susigyventi su tais negatyviais jausmais, kuriuos mums kelia šiuolaikinis prieštaringas perkaitas pasaulis?
Yes. Thank you. Yes, it's one of the big questions, isn't it? I mean, it's one of the big challenges that is facing us. So where should we begin? Well, for one thing, I think one thing that has been under-theorized is the weakening of the belief in progress. You know, I mean, when I grew up in the 1970s, there was a strong belief in progress. And officially, even in the Eastern Bloc, you know, there was a belief in progress. And many citizens sort of believed that things would be getting better, although there was a lot of resistance, and the regime and the government was quite unpopular. Excuse me. But there was a belief in technological and economic progress in most of the world. Things were getting better, and they would continue to get better. And my feeling is that, my persuasion is that this started to become weakened. Excuse me. Sorry about that. During the 1990s. So that the belief in progress, which had underpinned, you know, the project of modernity since the 19th century, was now faltering. I mean, if you take a country like Sweden, throughout the 19th century, in most of Swedish literature, there were references to God, the Bible. They were very pious. They were church-going. Suddenly, around the First World War, all of these references to God and religion disappeared and were replaced somehow by this belief in creating a new society where people have better health, a better standard of living, you know, better education, more opportunities, a longer life expectancy, and so on and so forth. So progress somehow replaced religion as a myth we lived by. And when progress is no longer taken for granted, we get trouble. You know, we get problems with sort of how to navigate. What kind of future do we see? And as you rightly point out, people vote against things and not for things to a great extent. And if you look at politicians, and not just in Europe, around the world, sorry about that, it's just a cough. It's nothing serious. I have a serious disease as well, but that doesn't result in coughs. The politicians no longer sell hope, but they sell fear. In the post-war, in the optimistic post-war years, and in the late Victorian era, in the late 19th century, politicians might say things such as, you know, we're now here, and in 30 years we're going to be there, and it's going to be incredibly difficult, and we need everybody has to contribute to the best of their abilities, but we've got to make it, because we're going to create this new, improved, better society. Whereas what they say now, as you suggest, is that you have to vote for us or else, you know, things are going to get really bad. So you try to attract voters through threats, not hope. So what Obama did, I mean, his exception in this picture was that he somehow projected a sense of hope. But it was quite vacuous, it was quite empty. He just said, yes, we can. But he didn't say what he could or they could, right? But there was an air of optimism around him that seduced lots of people. And of course, he had other good qualities as well. So, but on the whole, that has shifted. You have what my English colleague Frank Furedi, who's a sociologist at Kent, calls the politics of fear. The politics of fear. And how can we turn this around? Well, I think we need to think very hard about a new positive vision for our own communities, for our own societies, countries, and for humanity, and for the planet. A new positive vision. And there are enough challenges. The challenge of hatred, of course. The challenge of polarization, which we're going to talk about later on, I think. Of ideological polarization. But also the challenges of climate change, of inequality, of migration. I mean, all of these, you know, fairly big, hairy, substantial issues. We need probably to replace the old concept of progress with a new one, which is ecologically sustainable and which is globally more just. And what happened in the 1990s, several things took place in the 1990s. There was a general destabilization. It was the end of something which might have been a bit boring, but at least it was predictable, namely the Cold War that I grew up with. and you grew up with, the two-block system. I'm a bit older than you, so I was a grown man, when it ended. So I'm accustomed to thinking along this sort of two-block world. Suddenly you had a chaotic world which was difficult to understand. The first war after the end of the Cold War, probably the first, at least widely publicized war, was the Kuwait War, the Iraqi invasion in Kuwait in 1991. So that also happened in 1991. And it was difficult to read. Who are the good guys and who are the bad guys? Everybody agreed that Saddam Hussein was a bad guy. But Kuwait wasn't exactly a model for, human rights and democracy either. A country where only 16% of the population had political rights and the rest were migrant workers without passports and so on. So it was difficult to interpret, difficult to understand. So that's one thing that happened. But another thing that happened was that the issues to do with environmental change started to come up in a big way on a global level. That we were doing things to the planet that were probably the seeds of our own destruction in the long term. So coal, we have a civilization built on coal, and we have so much to be grateful to the coal about. We hadn't been sitting here in this warm, nice, smoke-free, lit up, fully sort of electrified and electronic room in comfortable chairs, had it not been for the coal. The coal revolution, which started around the end of the Napoleonic Wars. At that time, there was about 1 billion of us worldwide, and we had an average life expectancy of about 35 years. Okay, some countries a bit more, many countries a bit less. By now we're 7.5 billion, and we have a global life expectancy of nearly 70. Even in some fairly poor countries, people live until the age of, say, 60. So, or more. So it's been a spectacular success. But what slowly started to dawn upon many people in the 1990s was that the coal, which has been the salvation of humanity for 200 years, is now slowly becoming our damnation. And it's hard to get your head around that. It's very hard to have these two thoughts in your head at the same time. And I come from a country which is, saturated with oil and gas, right? Much of Norway's absurd and obscene prosperity and wealth is to do with the export of oil. And the country tries at the same time to project itself in the rest of the world as very sort of ecologically responsible and sustainable. And, we plant a lot of trees in the Amazon and we support, sustainable agriculture in Indonesia. But the money you use to sustain, to support that agriculture or to plant those trees is money taken from oil. So it's, you see, that is one basic double bind or contradiction in contemporary civilization, and the uncertainty about the future. The lack of a collective vision. So I think we need that collective vision. We need something which is difficult and necessary, and where everybody's efforts are needed. Yeah. And what we get instead is an economy which is increasingly financialized, where the economy is not so much about producing goods, but it's about moving papers around to make profits.
Strong manifesto. Tiesą sakant, aš jau žinau, kad piknaudžiauju auditorijos gerumu, nes yra daug žmonių norinčių jūsų paklausti, bet leiskit užduoti dar vieną klausimą ir po to pasiūlysiu įsijungti į diskusiją jums. Profesoriau, jūs kalbėjote apie vizijos poreikį, apie naujų galinčių mus suvienyt bendrai veiklai tikslų suformulavimą. Tačiau, skaitydamas jūsų knygą Akimirkos tironija, aš su dideliu susidomėjimu gilinausi į skyrių, kuriame aprašytas Lego Brickman, Lego kubelių žmogus ir Lego kubelių sindromas. Jūs šitoj knygoj teigiate, kad Lego kubelių žmogus jaučiasi viena vertus kaip rojuje, kita vertus kaip pragare. Jis turi daug spalvotų kubelių, su kuriais gali kurti ir vėl perkurti savo tapatybės, nuolat žaisdamas tais kubeliais, nes instrukcijos, ką daryti gyvenime jis privalo, nėra. Ar jūs taip pat galvojate apie šiuolaikinę visuomenę praėjus daugiau nei 20 metų, ar jūs matot, kad tie Lego kubelių žmonės ir toliau dominuoja, ir jeigu taip, tai ar Lego kubelių žmonės gali kurti stabilius identitetus ir juos išlaikyti ilgesnį laiką? Ir kitas klausimas, ar Lego kubelių žmonės, nuolat žaisdami ir perkurdami save, gali susitarti dėl kokių nors vizijų arba toli siekiančių tikslų?
Yeah, exactly. Well, I think someone who described this sort of this change, you might say change in personhood, change in the way we see ourselves as person. There are a few social theorists who have tried to do this before I did, but from a different perspective and also subsequently. Has there been a fundamental change in the way we conceive of a person? In the past, the idea was, in most pasts actually, the idea was for persons that you went through certain life stages and you left the life stages behind. And when you finally were an old man or woman sitting in a rocking chair, by the fireplace and a cup of tea, thinking about your life, you could actually weave together all these events as a continuous story, like a novel by Charles Dickens or Fyodor Dostoevsky. A novel which tells the story of people and how they go through different phases. Whereas increasingly, my feeling was at the time, and still is to some extent, that in this frantic time of change, this onslaught of fragmented information from all over the place, and experiences and opportunities and so on, we live increasingly lives which stand still at an enormous speed. Things are happening, lots of things are happening, but we're not really developing. And people are afraid. Many people are afraid to make long-term commitments. Getting married, having children, even planting a tree is something which is very slow, okay? You plant a tree and you know that it's not going to bear apple for another 10 years, at least if you do it in Northern Europe, where you have a fairly short growth season. Anthony Giddens, the English sociologist, once spoke about the self as a project. The self as a project. So that you look yourself in the mirror and you don't ask yourself, who am I? But you ask yourself, who do I want to be today? Who do I want to be? Because I can create and recreate myself. And if I'm not pleased with the person I am, I can become someone else. I think this resonates increasingly. If you look at popular newspapers around the world, it's not just in Western or sort of Northern Europe or whatever. You see a growth in lifestyle journalism about doing the right kinds of exercise, the right kind of diet, what kind of food should I eat, and what kind of food should I prepare if I have a dinner party, if I want to give the right impression. How should I learn more about wine so that I can entertain my friends, with knowledge about wine, etc. So there are so many choices, so many decisions that we make, which makes for fragmented lives. Another person who's written really well about this, by the way, another sociologist, is the American Richard Sennett, who also wrote a book quite a few years ago, which I still think has something to teach us, called The Corrosion of Character, where he says that, in the past generation, 1960s, 70s, people would stick to their jobs and they would have a long-term plan. They had to save money to pay down their house, for the children to get an education, and so they had a life project, which took them a few decades. The next generation, they're much better off. They have mobile phones and laptops, and they sit around in airports waiting for flights, and they have a better education, thanks to the father, who saved money, as a factory worker or whatever. And yet, their life doesn't hang together in the continuous story. You know, so I think this is also, it's a challenge that mirrors a challenge at a lot higher level. You know, I believe in these things sometimes, that there are pattern resemblances, that there are similarities between phenomena at very different scales, so that you have a world which is fragmented, a human world which lacks direction, which is full of opportunities, full of activities, where there's more diversity than ever, and productivity in the economy, and gadgets, and experiences, and tourism, and stuff, and cheap flights so that you can easily get from Oslo to Vilnius or wherever you want to go, which wasn't the case when I was a young man. I mean, flying was expensive. It was something you did very rarely. So you have that at the planetary level, but with no direction. And at the level of the individual, maybe we are seeing the same thing. I seem to see, this is anecdotal evidence, so you have to take it for that. I don't have the statistics. I don't have the research. But I have two short things to say, okay? And the first short thing is that, well, in my children's generation, they're about 20 now. I have 2 kids, they're about 20. People don't seem to have girlfriends and boyfriends in the way that we used to, okay? Yeah, I mean, they see people, and they may even go to bed with them. I mean, I'm not interfering with that, okay? But they don't have that sort of steady relationship. This is anecdotal evidence. I don't know how widespread it is, but I also hear others comment on that, which confirms what you were suggesting. And the other thing I wanted to say, I forgot. So we'll leave it there for now, and I'll return to it when I remember. No. The other thing I was going to say was that the reaction against this fragmented, overheated, accelerated modernity is a yearning for stability, for tradition. It may be nostalgic. And here we see one aspect of the current ideological polarization. You know, in the United States, I mean, between the plush and well-fed and well-off and arrogant and sophisticated and cosmopolitan people of places like New York and San Francisco and Washington, and the people in the Midwest, you know, who want different kinds of lives and who cannot identify with these so-called elites, you know, in the coastal cities, and who want stability, and who are yearning for a time when things were changing at a more human speed, so that you could yourself have an influence of your own life, and you were not just being overrun by the forces of globalization and so on. So in what you were saying about personhood, we can also see one facet of the ideological polarization.
Mielieji, pats laikas užduoti klausimus, jeigu tokių turite, prisijungti prie mūsų diskusijos, pasidalinti savo mintimis ir idėjomis, pakomentuoti tai, ką išgirdote, nes aš tikrai nenoriu piktnaudžiauti jūsų gerumu ir pasimti visą profesoriaus laiką, svarstydamas tik tai, kas man rūpi.
Okay, thank you. So you mentioned an example of Seychelles, and that the young generation of Seychelles, they want to escape, they want to become a part of some bigger culture, for example, French or American. Would you say that this example shows that this idea of becoming a part of some culture is the support of an idea of a nation state? Is the nation state becoming stronger, or is this maybe a fact of emerging of new world culture? So the debate about the world culture and the nation state. And second kind of question, that if the world culture is emerging, then can this world culture be the way by which this overheating problem can be solved? For example, if we think of ourselves as human beings together, united as a planet that has some problems, climate change, let's solve that together. So can this thinking of identity of ourselves as one culture, change and introduce this stoppage?
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, another great question and a very, very complicated one. But let me put it this way. It's not a matter of either or. I think that when we live in these small countries that we do, you and I mean Lithuania or Norway, small countries, not very well known in the rest of the world, we need to do both. Because if you only become a cosmopolitan, as it were, and a member of a sort of a world culture, you lose your past and you lose many things. I mean, there are certain things that can only be said in Lithuanian, certain things can only be said in Norwegian, and there are certain experiences which are only here, which cannot be transferred, and which lose something when you try to place them or put them on Instagram, or you try to market them and turn them into some kind of, I don't know, commercial attraction. So you really need that, and this is probably one area where the urban cosmopolitans, as I would call them, I don't talk about left and right in politics. I don't think it's accurate anymore. But the urban cosmopolitans have underestimated, the force of tradition. That it's important for you to have self-esteem. Because what could happen in a small place like the Seychelles, if we take that as an example, but it could have been, a small European country. What is happening there is that, maybe people may feel more connected, okay, because they become fluent in English and they look and speak as if they were ghetto kids, from Harlem, but they lose their sense of where they're coming from and what went before them. What has happened to indigenous people around the world, especially in the rich countries, where they've been integrated, as it were, into the majority, is that they have gained a lot in terms of health, standard of living, life expectancy, education, but they've lost their connection with where they came from. They are being told that everything that your parents did, your grandparents did, and so on, your ancestors, is rubbish. Just forget it. Leave it all behind and become like us, and you'll be happy. Right? So we need to be careful to avoid that kind of rhetoric that many people feel that they are exposed to. But having said this, yes, we do need a global consciousness. And in fact, if you think back to the philosopher Hegel, Kant and Hegel were some of the first philosophers who were thinking about global issues, because they saw this sort of interconnected world emerging through colonialism, through travel, through increased knowledge, writing at the end of the Enlightenment in many ways. So for Kant, it was the idea of the cosmopolitan, of hospitality, of respecting others, of allowing foreigners into your country or into your house, and treating them decently. And for Hegel, it was the spread of the world spirit, the Weltgeist. We somehow now see this Weltgeist on the World Wide Web, in this myriad of chaotic and confusing and complex messages which are moving back and forth on the World Wide Web. You gradually see the emergence of something we could call a global conversation about who we are and where we're going as humanity. It's not perfect. It's not equal. It's not as if everybody takes part. But there is a move towards this, which I think is very promising. So, interpreted optimistically, the backlash that we are seeing now with anti-Semitism, with racism, with paranoia, with withdrawal, as you see in the United States now, withdrawal from international cooperation, which is so crucial to that country, that they don't know what they're losing until it's too late. But these tendencies are merely a reaction against a much deeper and more pervasive tendency towards a global conversation, where what is happening in Brazil has consequences for you. And you know that if some of the islands of the Pacific are suddenly being inundated by the ocean, they disappear because of storms and rising tides, it's bad news for us as well. if a rare species of beetle, an insect, goes extinct in Australia, you know that this will probably, this is due to a global process which will also have effects here. So in other words, the awareness of being globally interconnected is spreading, is becoming more widespread. And what we are seeing now in the polarization, ideological polarization between what I would call urban cosmopolitans and nativists is an outcome of this. And we have to find the balance between being rooted and being mobile, being local and being global at the same time. In the past, I mean, in the 1970s, they used to say things such as, I mean, that was a slogan in the Green movement in the 1970s when I was a kid. Think locally, act globally. No, it was the other way around. But now I think maybe we should think locally and act globally, right? Because your actions are global by their consequence, by their implications. Yeah, think globally, act locally. And the other way around, both at the same time.
Well, what do you think about future perspectives for the globalization? For example, is so-called neoliberalism the only possible way for the global development? Thank you.
Yes, thanks a lot. Well, the short answer is no. I don't think global neoliberalism... I mean, global neoliberalism, which is really just a sort of an acceleration, intensification and globalization of capitalism, of the market economy, has its limitations because you can run markets in that way through supply and demand and comparative advantages and so on and so forth. But it's no way to run a society because a society needs other things as well. Society needs cohesion. It needs solidarity. It has a lot of needs which are not satisfied by the way people think along the market. And I see in my own world, namely the world of academia, that increasingly there is a perception in parts of academia and outside that the only things which are sort of worth studying and worth doing research on are things that can be counted and measured. But we all know that what matters in life cannot be counted and measured. Such things as love, you know, I mean, these intangible things that motivate us from day to day. So there are strong limitations. But regarding the future of globalization, it's not going away. And I think, you know, we should think about globalization in terms of not so much in terms of the economy, perhaps, but in terms of politics and communication. One of the big contradictions that we haven't had the time to talk about yet in this accelerating, globalized world is the growing gap between decision-making and the people who are decided upon. So that the distance is growing between people's lives and the forces that shape them. And this is a result of globalization and of global neoliberalism. So to just give you a very short example of what I'm talking about from Australia. One of the conflicts that I'm writing about in this book from this community in Australia is about a mine. It's a small mine, but the mine is dependent on pumping out water to get to the limestone, because they use the limestone to produce cement. For a long time, this was a locally owned enterprise. It was small scale. It wasn't global neoliberal capitalism. It was small scale capitalism. It was a local enterprise. So if you had a complaint as a farmer, because Australians are obsessed with water, there is never enough of it. And when you finally get water, you get too much. You know, you get a flood. So they're obsessed with it. There wasn't enough water. People would pump out water on their property, and there wasn't enough. The water was bad, you know, in quality. So they could go to the manager, and the manager was a local guy. So they could go to the manager and say, "Look, I mean, Mr. Smith, you've been pumping out so much water that it's affecting my livestock. I don't get enough water now from my well to feed to water my cattle. And Mr. Smith would sit behind the desk and say, yes, Mr. Jones, I'll make a note of this, and I'll ring you up next week and we'll sort it out. Because they know each other, they live in the same area, and maybe the kids even go to school together. So that, in other words, they share a moral community. They share a moral community, and they share a world of experience. Mr. Smith, behind the desk, who's a director, he knows perfectly well what's going on and what are the consequences when the farmers don't get enough water, because he's lived there much of his life. Now, fast forward about 20 years to now. You go into the same office with the same complaint, and you say, you know, the same thing. But the guy behind the desk is no longer a local guy. He's someone who has been hired. He's an Englishman who has been brought over from New Zealand. And the company is no longer local. It's been amalgamated into a huge company called Cement Australia, which is one of the largest cement corporations in the world. And the guy behind the desk would now say, I'm sorry, Mr. Jones, but I don't know much. I mean, I don't know much about these local things. And besides, I'm not in a position to take that decision. So you have to contact our main office. You have to send an email or contact, you know, our main office in Sydney or London or wherever, which is much harder. And they know nothing about you, and they don't have to respond. This is the feeling that lots of people in Middle America had before they voted for Trump. That the people in Washington just didn't care about them. Or people in Doncaster in England who voted for Brexit in northern England, a place which is known for high levels of unemployment. That there's a gap. There's a gap of scale here between us and the people who decide upon us. And they don't really care about us. They know little about us and they don't care. So this is one of the big sort of crises of contemporary globalization, that neoliberalism only serves to deepen and does nothing to resolve.
Thank you for a very interesting lecture. I would like, ask a double question. One of first, small comment about progress. I think we underestimate that always progress has side effects, like inventing of antibiotics lead to appearance of tuberculosis that is resistant to antibiotics and so on. So we sometimes don't pay enough attention to the side effects of the progress. But you said at the beginning of your lecture that there is no, how to say, when we look at the society and broader, there is no such a feedback that controls the process. But I think that the present rise of, we call it right-wing populism and hatred and identity politics could be an example of existence of that feedback. But that feedback possibly acts not so quickly as we expect, and have also some negative aspects of that. But in general, so all the processes that are going on in the world, there is a kind of global control if you look at the system. And another thing, we are talking a lot about climate change, environment, but we forget that the biggest problem is not environment itself. We should remember famous person Malthus, who talked about demographic boom 200 years ago, and the result of our problem, I guess, is mainly not only the side effects of technology and so on, but that the big increase of population and need for the resources and the problem is that only quite limited. It is problem that is tried to resolve only like in separate places like India and China, but not addressed globally. So what do you think about that? Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. Well, I guess you used the term, I spoke, the feedback. I used the sort of the metaphor of the thermostat, but it's really the same thing, that the system itself sort of reacts to changes. Yes, I think we have to talk about population, but we shouldn't be obsessed by it. Because as has been pointed out many times, if everybody lived like an average Indian, the planet would be fine, even with 9 billion people. But if everybody wants to live like a Californian, it would be a disaster within a few months. So, but of course, population has something to do with it. Population, together with the advances of technology and the economic growth and the growth in expectations and prosperity, and the fact that, I visited China for the first time last year. I mean, I should have gone many years ago, of course, but for various reasons I didn't. And when I grew up, the image we had of Chinese cities was hundreds of bicycles, which were sort of standing at crossroads or whatever, waiting to cross. And I now came to China. This was a small Chinese city of just a couple of million people in the remote part of China. I was interested in it because they had some minority issues, okay? There were a few bikes in bicycle lanes, but mainly what you saw were hundreds and thousands of cars waiting for the green light. So that sort of shift, that when everybody wants a car, everybody wants a nice plasma screen where they can watch Netflix and a lovely holiday, preferably in a place with coconut trees or whatever. When you get that situation, clearly the size of the population has something to do with it. And let me just mention to you that one of the great sort of visionaries, controversial visionaries, who've been thinking about planetary matters and the environment and so on, a man called James Lovelock, who must now be into his 1990s. And he was a person who coined the metaphor of Gaia for speaking about the planet. I mean, he took it from Greek, the Greek goddess of the earth. But he said that Gaia, we can think about the world as a self-regulating system. The planet is a self-regulating system. And his idea was in the 1960s and 70s that we can inflict a lot of harm on the planet through nuclear tests, through pollution and whatnot, and the planet would somehow recover. But he changed his mind, at a certain point. And he said in one of his later books from 2007 called The Revenge of Gaia, Lovelock says that when there was only about 1 billion of us around the end of the Napoleonic Wars, we could have done pretty much what we liked, and Gaia would recover. But now there's 7 billion of us, and counting. And so we need rules, we need regulations, we need restrictions. Otherwise, things are going to end in a very bad way for us. And this is, I think, to me, this is fairly important to point out that when we use fossil fuels, one thing is what we do, to the environment and to climate and so on. But it's also a destructive. It's a destructive way of producing energy because you use it up. You use up energy that it's taken the planet millions and millions of years to produce, and it's not coming back. Well, it is coming back, but you have to wait for another 60 million years. So you have to be very patient. So that's part, but that's a partial answer to your incredibly complex question. When it comes to right-wing populism as a feedback or as a kind of feedback, yes, if we could deal with it properly, if we could sit around the table and talk things over and not think about the other side as the enemy, that would help. If we could realize that we're all in this together, which doesn't happen, partly because of the growing gaps that I just mentioned between different segments of the population. And it's not merely about left and right in politics. It's not even merely about who's rich and who's poor. But it's about how you are positioned in relation to these sort of cosmopolitan and globalizing processes and how you feel about it. I could have said more about that, but I think that is one of the big burning issues that we need to address in almost every country in the world now. To find a way of to just sit around the table and speak in a civilized way about shared concerns instead of trying to demonize each other. and spread suspicion and hatred, as some people do these days, increasingly, and with great success, unfortunately.
Hello, thanks for a very interesting lecture. I have a question. So we're talking about this increasingly growing population of the world, and the paradox is that still so many countries are saying that the birth rates are really low, even though we don't even have resources on Earth to provide for all the people to have quality lives, and the forests are being cut. Animals are being killed for food in enormous space, and pollution is incredibly high. And so what do you think could be the solution? Should someone really start controlling these birth rates, or is circular economy maybe a solution? Sharing economy, companies like Uber, Airbnb, etc. So how do you think this will be solved or could be solved?
Great question. And I think, and it's not just something I think, I'm convinced. There's no single solution. We need a lot of imagination. We need to use our imagination and try out different solutions. Probably we should scale down the economy. Probably sometimes we should scale the economy sideways, as they do with Airbnb and Uber, with that kind of model, that you have lots of little nodes which are interconnected, instead of large hierarchical companies which are competing for world domination. So I think that's part of it. When it comes to, scaling down a circular economy would be great, that you know where the things you're using actually are coming from, and you know where they're going afterwards, so that you think sustainably about your own consumption and so on. That would be part of my solution. Not the whole thing, but part of it. When it comes to the question of population, what you were saying, I think many of us have thought about that. There is general agreement that, there are enough of us now. On the whole, there are enough of us. We don't have to double the global population. And yet, in every country, there is a concern when birth rates are going down, which to me shows the limitations of nationalism, doesn't it? That politicians are unable to see their own sort of country in a global context, and collaborate with others, with other governments around the same issues. So we should increase our population, but everybody else should reduce theirs. That would be the attitude, limitation of an unreformed nationalism. Yeah, thank you.
So this one phrase you said, it really resonated with me about the economy of moving papers around. And I am personally a big science fiction fan. And in the classic of science fiction, there is this very strong belief in that technology will come and make everything better. For example, we'll have a replicator that will just produce everything from the bare atoms, just construct everything from atoms for several cents you can make a car. So, and it did happen. The cost of production is significantly reduced. As you mentioned, this coal revolution. We live in the very advanced world, and this. So, as I understand your thought, the economy becomes about the management of people who manage people managing people, not about the production of actual things. So this way, the society, the identity, the thinking of people about themselves becomes kind of centered on the people, not on the things. Mm-hmm. For example, as city dwellers today, I think many of this auditoria are city dwellers. We really don't understand the people from the villages, and people from the villages and the identity of people living from earth, from vegetables, they really understand how fragile it is, how you can totally destroy the ecology of a field and not get the crops you need to survive. So how can we escape this, the theoretical, we are talking theoretical, and the theory is that we are stuck in the cycle of doom where we become detached. Economy becomes the economy of economy and not the economy of things, and because it is an economy of economy, it's not responsible, it destroys ourselves, it destroys climate. How do we escape that?
Well, I'm sorry. Yes, it's a great question. I obviously don't have. There's no single answer to this, but we need to raise the. We need to raise that kind of question, and there's been a virtualization of the economy where it's sometimes hard to tell not only who to go to with your complaints. As the example from Australia illustrates, because it's so complicated. I mean, who owns this factory? It's not like in the 19th century there was a single sort of person with a top hat and a waistcoat and a golden watch, you know, owned the factory, and you could go to him with your complaints. Now it's a conglomerate with some Chinese interests, some Japanese, some Indian, some Australian, and so on in many of these corporations. So the gap between the people and their lives, whether they live in the town or in the village, and the powers that be, is becoming insurmountable. They're so distant that they only exist on the screen. And similarly with the economy. As a footnote or an aside, let me mention that, yes, I mean, we produce what we need now much more efficiently than before, much more efficiently. And John Maynard Keynes, the great English economist, predicted as early as the 1930s that by the end of the 20th century, people might only have to work 15 hours a week, or maybe even less, because of automation and increased efficiency, and so on and so forth. And we got automation and increased efficiency and machine power, and we still work about 40 hours a week. How come? Why do we do this? Well, maybe because so many of us are busy sending emails and moving papers around and sitting in meetings. There's a colleague of mine who has a theory about this. It's a bit conspiratorial. I don't subscribe to it 100%, and maybe it's just a nice theory and not a good one, but it's interesting. He's called David Graeber, and the book is called Bullshit Jobs. And he also wrote an article called Bullshit Jobs, I mean, some years ago. And a bullshit job is a job which nobody would have missed if it hadn't been there, you know? Nobody would have noticed the difference. And he especially, I mean, he identifies, you know, finance, middle management, advertising, and so on. I think he's wrong in some ways, because I think work does a lot of things for us. It's not merely about producing added value. It's also about lots of other things. But it's an interesting thought. So, I don't have the answer, but I think we're talking about a lot of things here at this meeting. So if I were to say something about my vision for the future of the planet, I would say that it has to be modern. We mustn't betray the ideals of modernity. It has to be modern. It has to be forward-looking. It has to be optimistic and progressive. And we have to believe that we can improve things. That society is created by humanity. And we've done a lot of good things in the past and some wrong things. And now we can do things a bit better. It has to be modern. It has to be green. And it has to bring power back to the people at the local level, so that a person in the Midwest or in Doncaster or in rural Lithuania feels that there are some people up there who listen to me, and I have an influence on my own life. I'm not just being overrun by anonymous forces, such as finance and Brussels and whatever. Yeah. We have a few more questions, I think. I think there were several others. I'll try to give short answers now.
When it comes to self-regulation and actually compass or about modernity, where to go to, actually that comes to definition of quality, and I think that's the huge question, the biggest challenge of nowadays, because we lost compass, and then what definition of quality is, it's very hard to agree. So we have a lot of friction, like palms, instead of sometimes collisions, and friction produces heat, increase entropy, then it's hard to manage things and so on. So my question would be about where do you see sources of that intelligence about defining quality? It definitely is not so much in church. Definitely it is not in universities, because universities, they are losing humanitarian mode, and they are going very technical, so they are not defining what quality is about, but they are just making things efficient towards some crazy compass. So my question would be, where from the quality may come, definition of quality may come from? Maybe from big corporations or Marvel's cinema studio, because we lost compass. And the question is, let's say in Oslo, you have the old place Dovrehallen, which is abandoned now, and you have very nice. That's the fancy place of '60s, and you have the absolutely great Jule food, Christmas food, lutefisk. And my question is, do you have any promoters in Oslo who actually promote culture of lutefisk and old style Dovrehallen? Where the definition of quality comes from? Who are promoters of quality nowadays?
It's it's another incredibly complicated question, and maybe I can. I don't think I'm in the right position to answer it, but it's important that we think about quality in a broad sense, not just what you were mentioning, but also, I mean, what is the quality of life? What's the point of our lives? Is it just consumption? Probably not. It's something else. And as I said, I mean, earlier on, there is a tendency these days that it's to an increasing part of the world or the public sphere, the economy, politics, and so on. The only things that exist are those that can be counted and measured. But quality cannot be counted or measured. It has to be evaluated in a different way, as you were saying. And and there is no common standard, as it were. So we probably need that conversation as well. And I would start by having a conversation about the quality of life. What is a meaningful life? What is a good life? And then you can branch out and you discover that, I mean, the good life is about eating slow food. Traditional, slow, good food, or the meaning of life is also about, having sustained, long-term, warm relationships with other people. Because that's really what makes life worthwhile, worth living, and so on and so forth. So it's about other things. It's not about Marvel, comics, and not about corporations. Although they you have these forces to contend with. So that would be another version, another aspect of this sort of what I think of as a new vision for modernity, the next step for humanity. We now have, in some ways. We seem to have painted ourselves into a corner where we're destroying the planet, there's increasing inequality, there's climate change, and there's also a feeling that there is an emptiness about consumerism. It can only get you so far. It doesn't make you happy in the long run. So how can we move ahead from that? The 20th century taught us a bit about authoritarianism, about utopianism, utopias which give you one solution. This is the only way, and everybody should do as I say. You know all about that in this part of the world. Not the way to go. So we've learned something from our mistakes, and now perhaps we can move ahead. Beyond overheating, cooling down, and finding our way.
Aš manau, kad dabar pats laikas padaryti tam tikrus apibendrinimus ir mes daug kalbėjom šiandien apie nerimą keliančius ženklus, kuriuos mes matom šiuolaikiniam pasauly, bet profesorius Thomas Hyllandu Eriksenu kalbėjo ir apie viltingus dalykus. Ir galvodamas apie tai, ką reikėtų pasakyti mūsų diskusijos pabaigoje, aš tiesiog varčiau knygą Akimirkos tironija ir leiskit pacituoti keletą sakinių iš šios knygos, kurie patraukė mano dėmesį. Knutas Hamsunas amerikiečius apibūdino kaip nerimastingus. Šis žodis puikiai tinka ir mūsų dabarčiai apibūdinti. Kai nelieka laiko atokvėpiams ir pertraukoms, žmogus netenka galimybės atsiriboti nuo savo darbų ir pamatyti visumą. Jis paskęsta detalėse ir pameta bendrą vaizdą. Aš tikiuosi, kad atėję į susitikimą su Oslo universiteto antropologijos profesorium Thomasu Hyllandu Eriksenu, jūs turėjot galimybę bent valandą ištrūkti iš to greito laiko srovės, susikurti bent keletą minučių atokvėpiui ir leistis į svarbių klausimų svarstybas. Ačiū labai profesoriui už tokią puikią galimybę. Užsimti rimtais dalykais, lėtai ir labai atidžiai svarstyti tam tikrus klausimus. Thank you very much, dear professor.
Thank you.